you please pray with me? May the words of my mouth and meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, for you are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. It's kind of a weird Sunday. I mean, more than just that I'm up here talking. It's kind of a weird Sunday. After all, it's after Thanksgiving, and people are up to here with food. It's not Advent, and it's too early to talk about the coming of Christ, and it's certainly too early to talk about the wise ones who were following a star, or how Mary and Joseph became refugees and had to flee for their very life as the innocent children were slaughtered. So what do we do with such a conundrum? In the liturgical church, it is officially called the Reign of Christ Sunday. But being in the desert, being that it hardly ever rains here, our worship ministry, our stewardship ministry decided that this would be Stewardship Sunday, Commitment Sunday. 2 weeks ago, we heard from a variety of people as to why being at a church whose mission it is to live God's grace, justice, and inclusiveness is important to them. What's important to them? Those were some of the best stewardship presentations I've ever heard. We also got a review of some financial numbers that Sunday. Last week, it was me reminding all of us about the widow's mite, and that all we have and all that we are is a gift from God, and we need to share all that we have and all that we are. Now, while an entire year's worth of sermons on any aspect of our mission statement would be incomplete, let me just briefly touch on God's grace, justice, and inclusiveness by sharing some personal stories. God's grace is large. God's grace is large enough to reach around the world and embrace everyone. Everyone? What about those people? Yes, they're included in God's grace. But how about... Yes, they're included in God's grace too. God's grace embraces the peacemakers and those who sow chaos, the victim, the perpetrator. God's grace is even large enough for you and me. And while God's grace is bigger than you and I can imagine, I want to share some quick glimpses of how God's grace has touched me. Because God's grace is also so small that it reaches the cracks and the crevices of the moments you and I live every day. This week I saw a lot of grace. Wow. This week my mom was in that automobile accident, and I'm glad that she's okay and that the other driver's okay. I'm grateful that Wendy and I both work at places where we could literally drop what we were doing and attend to family needs. When I finally arrived home late that Monday, totally exhausted, the phone rang. It was from a former parishioner from the 1990s. Remember back then? We exchanged Christmas cards, haven't spoken in over a decade. Haven't spoken in over a decade. He called. He's in his 90s. He has an Irish accent. And he said, I was looking through an old church directory and I saw your name and something said I needed to call you today. He went on to say some very nice things and remind me of some good memories. A small act of grace. Huge impact. Isn't that what the church is all about? We don't stop within our four walls of this building. It reaches out, God's grace, across the decades and across the miles. Any of you remember what you were doing on February 26, 1978? I have to confess, I don't remember what I was doing. But now, I didn't save this. None of my family saved this. But when I first came to this church as pastor, Nancy Schneck gave me this. Apparently, on February 26, 1978, little Paul Whitlock played the piano for special music that Sunday. And she saved it. An act of grace. And just by coincidence, didn't know this was happening, they presented me today something. It was from the paper from July 20th, 1986. Remember back in the 80s, some of you? Anniversary of Maynard parents. But in the top corner, there is a picture of a young couple, and it says, Chubbuck Whitlock Wedding. Just happens to be on the same page. You want to see what I looked like those many years ago? You want to see what Wendy looked like? Exactly the same. Just look at her right now. That's all you got to do. Little acts of kindness and grace have a huge impact in people's lives. I see grace woven throughout our lives. A harsh word that's exchanged instead with a kind one. An act of reconciliation and forgiveness instead of an act of revenge. People sitting down and talking and listening and learning together. God's grace is big enough to cover our tough stuff, but also small enough to cover the things that just, push our buttons. I see God's grace woven throughout our life together here. I see it in so many ways. I see God's grace woven throughout our justice in many ways, in our fight for marriage equality, and our honoring of same-sex marriages and relationships as we do with different gender relationships. I see our work for justice in Paz de Cristo, not only serving the homeless and the working poor. It's more than just bringing food every Sunday and serving down there. It's providing people with a little dignity by providing clean socks and underwear. It's donating jeans and providing job training so that people can have a chance in life. I was told earlier this year by Paz, we're the only religious body in this town that donates to them every month without fail. Now, some may have a drive around Thanksgiving or some other time. We're the only one doing it year-round. While I'm proud of the church for that, I also realize that means we have a long ways to go in this fair city to empower the poor. There have been times this past year when your church has been leading the cry of justice in other ways. This past year, we hosted a night where the Mesa Police Department and immigration lawyers and undocumented folks dreaming of being U.S. citizens all got together in one room, this room, and talked and listened to one another and with each other. Talk about important conversations. A small act of justice, a huge impact in the lives of people. Justice is about helping people who are powerless. The words of our final hymn, I am the light of the world, say it so well, and if I don't go on and on and on and on and on in this sermon, in about 5 minutes, we're going to be able to sing that song, these words. To find the lost and lonely one, to heal the broken soul with love, to feed the hungry children with warmth and good food, to feel the earth below the sky above, to free the prisoner from all chains, to make the powerful care, to rebuild the nations with strength of goodwill, to see God's children everywhere. That's why I say the church is the opposite of Vegas. What goes on here in this very room doesn't stay here. God's inclusiveness, boy, it means a lot of things. It means more than just people who are part of the LGBT community. It means everyone and anyone who has ever felt like an outsider. Wendy and I were talking recently and sharing stories of inclusiveness. And one of the stories that Wendy talks about her grandpa Schrader was that Wendy's grandpa was one of the soldiers who helped open up the Jewish concentration camps as the U.S. moved into Germany at the end of World War II. And after the war, he and his wife and their daughter, Wendy's mom, settled in a small town in the Midwest. And the story goes that a Jewish doctor and his family moved into town. And that good Christian community was in shock and shunned them. And that didn't sit well with Wendy's grandpa. So he got his family dressed up in their Sunday best to show respect, because that's what you did back then. And prominently walked through town right up to that doctor and his family and said, "Welcome." That's what God's inclusiveness is all about. And interesting enough, those families became friends. And Wendy's mom became friends with the doctor's daughter. God's grace reaches out beyond our particular culture, our particular faith, and provides a welcome to all. And finally, one brief story about God's inclusiveness. I got Nathan's permission to share this story. You might remember that Nathan was drum major a couple of years ago. I sort of mentioned that once or twice, or 3 or 4 or 5 times, maybe before. When Nathan was in the band, he was part of the Cool Group. I know you think he got that from me, but no, that's not. It's from his mother's side, I think. Well, there was a young man in that band who had the courage to come out and say, "I'm gay." And to the most part, and to that band's credit, most of the kids were fine with that. But that band is a very good band, and they travel beyond this state. And that meant there needed to be room assignments. Nathan was in a power seat. Everybody wants to room with the drum major, to be seen with the cool kid, the big man on campus. Not every band member wanted to room with someone who was gay. Not every parent wanted their child to room in the same hotel room with someone who was gay. Hanging around the cafeteria, around the band room, oh, that's fine. But not in a hotel. And I remember asking him in just a casual conversation, "Oh yeah, who you rooming with?" And he kind of mumbled under his breath and just didn't really say much of anything. And I asked again, I said, "Who you rooming with?" And he said quietly, "No one else wants to room with." And he named the kid. "So I'm going to sign up with him." And I said, "Okay. Because you have helped teach him about God's inclusiveness, he was able to put into practice beyond these walls. Because what goes on here doesn't stay here. It goes out wherever we live and work and are. We are the opposite of Vegas around here. What goes on here, God's grace, God's justice, God's inclusiveness, doesn't stay here. You might say, "Well, I thought this was supposed to be a stewardship sermon." Well, Wendy and I tithe to this church. We are here and have our family here because all three of our children can learn and live God's grace, justice, and inclusiveness. And that's important to us. And I thank you for that gift. Thanks be to God.